In a frozen land ruled by fear and power, what happens when one man dares to say no? Tonight's story begins with a storm, but the real danger isn't the cold. It's the kind of law that protects the powerful and crushes the innocent. Keep watching, because what starts as a simple act of kindness will turn into a fight against a system built on lies. If you believe in standing up for what's right, please like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to support more stories like this.
The wind didn't just blow in the Wyoming Territory, it hunted. It was December 1878, the kind of cold that clawed right through a wool coat and settled deep in a man's bones. Elias Cole sat low in the saddle. His hat was pulled down tight. His horse, Dust, trudged through snow that was already knee-deep. They were 15 miles out from Sweetwater, 15 miles from nowhere. Elias was a man who minded his own business. 5 years ago, he'd turned in his deputy marshal badge, buried his wife, buried his unborn child. Since then, he kept his eyes straight ahead. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. But Dust stopped. The old gelding tossed his head, blowing out thick white steam. "Keep moving," Elias rasped. His voice sounded like dry gravel. Dust didn't move. The horse was looking at something off the trail. Elias squinted through the driving whiteout. A drift, just a snowdrift against a cluster of frozen sagebrush. But then the drift moved. His hand went to his Colt. Instinct. 15 years of tracking men leaves a mark. He stepped down from the saddle. The snow crunched loud in the dead air. He walked closer, hands still resting on the cold iron of his gun. It wasn't a drift. It was a woman. She was sitting in the snow, her back pressed against a rock. The snow was already piling up on her shoulders. Her face was the color of old paper. Her lips were a bruised purple, but her eyes, they were gray, and they were wide open, looking right at him. She wasn't dead, not yet. Then Elias heard it. A sound so small, the wind almost tore it away. A thin, reedy cry. She was clutching a bundle of blankets to her chest. Elias froze. He hadn't heard a baby cry in 5 years. Didn't want to hear it now. He wanted to get back on his horse. He wanted to ride to his warm, empty cabin, lock the door, and let the world freeze. He took a half-step back. The woman spoke. Her voice was cracked, barely a whisper, but it didn't shake. There was steel in it. "I am not begging you," she said. "But could you hold my baby? Just for a minute so I can stand up?" She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading for her life. She was stating what she needed to keep her child alive. She had kept her pride, even as the ice was taking her. Elias stood there, the snow swirling around them. If I keep riding, he thought to himself, I'll be safe in my cabin. If I turn back, I'll have to face the world I've been trying so hard to escape. He looked at his horse. He looked at the trail leading home. Then he looked at the woman. Elias Cole dropped to his knees in the snow. He didn't hesitate anymore. He reached out his large, calloused hands. Clara carefully transferred the bundle to him. Elias looked down. A tiny, red, wrinkled face peered out from the heavy wool. The baby was crying, fighting the cold with everything he had. Elias held him against his chest, shielding him from the wind. He looked at the baby, then up at the shivering woman trying to push herself up from the frozen ground. He felt something break open in his chest. An old dam finally giving way. He spoke aloud, his voice steady over the howling wind. He needed her to hear it, and maybe he needed to hear it himself. "A man can lose everything in this life," Elias said, the words heavy and deliberate. His wife, his child, his badge, his honor. But if he loses the ability to stop for a shivering life, he is no longer human. He shifted the baby, tucking the bundle tighter against his heavy coat to share his body heat. "Dignity isn't found in what we own," Elias continued, looking Clara right in the eye. "It's found in what we refuse to abandon. You didn't abandon him, and I won't abandon you." Clara stopped struggling for a second. She stared at the stranger holding her son. "My name is Elias Cole," he said. He stood up, keeping the baby secure in one arm, and offered his other hand to her. "My cabin is 5 miles from here. Get on my horse, ma'am." Clara looked at his hand. Then she looked at the trail. "I don't know you," she whispered. "No, you don't," Elias said. "But you know I'm not leaving you here." She took his hand. Her fingers were like ice, but her grip was tight. He pulled her to her feet. He helped her up into Dust's saddle, then handed the baby back up to her arms. Elias took the reins. He didn't look back at the town of Sweetwater. He didn't look back at the life of isolation he had built. He turned his horse around, and they started walking into the storm. The cabin appeared out of the whiteout like a ghost, just a dark square against a darker mountain, a single window glowing dull orange. Elias pulled back on the reins. Dust stopped, his sides heaving. The wind was screaming now. It tore at their coats. It threw ice like rock salt against their faces. Elias swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the snow heavy. He tied the horse to the porch rail. Not the barn, not yet. He needed them inside first. He walked back to Clara. She was frozen in the saddle, literally. Her hands were locked in the horse's mane. Elias reached up. "Let go," he said over the wind. She didn't. Maybe she couldn't. He put his hands over hers. His fingers were thick, calloused, warm, despite the storm. He gently pried her fingers loose. Then he grabbed her by the waist and lifted her down. She hit the ground and her legs gave out. Elias caught her. He didn't say a word. He just hooked his arm under hers, supporting her weight, and guided her up the 3 wooden steps to the door. He kicked it open. They stepped inside. The sudden quiet was jarring. The wind was still howling outside, but in here, it was just a dull roar against thick logs. The air smelled of dry pine, old ash, and isolation. "Sit," Elias said. Elias. He guided her to a heavy wooden chair near the cast-iron stove in the center of the room. The fire was banked low, just red coals. Elias grabbed an iron poker. He stirred the coals, threw on 3 pieces of split cedar, and opened the draft. The fire caught instantly. Light danced across the room. Clara didn't look at the room. She looked at her bundle. She peeled back the heavy wet wool. Her hands were shaking. She did it methodically. First the face, then the tiny hands, then the feet, checking for frostbite, checking for life. James was sleeping. His face was flushed. His chest rose and fell in tiny, rapid breaths. He was alive. Clara let out a breath she sounded like she'd been holding for miles. She slumped back in the chair. Elias watched her. He stood by the stove, hands in his pockets. He took in the room through her eyes. It was small, clean, empty. There was a bed in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, a small shelf with a few worn books. No curtains, no rugs, no pictures on the walls. It wasn't a home. It was a box to sleep in. Elias turned away. He walked to a small counter. He took a heavy iron pot, set it on the stove. He poured water from a bucket, added a tin of thick dried pea soup. He cut a thick slice of hard bread, set it on a tin plate. He set the plate and a steaming mug of water on the table near her. "Eat," he said. "Drink the water slow. It's hot." Clara looked at the food. She looked at him. Her gray eyes were sharp, even through the exhaustion. "I will pay you," she said. Her voice was steady. "When I can. I can work. I can sew. I can cook." Elias stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her. She was battered, broken down, freezing, and she was still trying to buy her right to exist in his space. He walked back to the stove. He put his hands on his hips. He took a slow breath. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice deep, carrying through the quiet room. "In this house, you don't need to buy your safety with labor." Clara blinked. She clutched the baby a little tighter. "The right to live," Elias continued, speaking clearly, making sure every word landed. "And the right to be protected is a God-given right for every child and every mother. It is not a debt to be mortgaged. Out here on the frontier, we share our warmth because it is the right thing to do, not because it's a transaction. He pointed a thick finger at the plate. Eat the soup. You're feeding two. Clara stared at him. The hardness in her jaw softened. Just a fraction. She nodded once. She reached for the spoon. Elias went out to the barn to care for Dust. When he came back an hour later, Clara was asleep in the chair. The baby was tucked tight against her chest. Elias didn't wake her. He went to his bed in the corner. He stripped the heavy wool blankets off. He laid them on the floor near the stove. He walked over to Clara. "Mrs. Reed," he said quietly. She woke with a start, panic in her eyes. Then she remembered where she was. "The bed is yours," Elias said. "No," she said instantly. "I can sleep here, in the chair. You have a child. The child needs a bed. I'm used to the floor." "You are not used to the floor in your own house." Elias looked at her. "You don't know what I'm used to." It wasn't meant to be mean, it was just a fact. Clara looked at the blankets on the floor, looked at the bed. She looked down at James. "Yes," she said softly. "I'm sorry." She moved to the bed. Elias lay down on the floor. He turned his back to the room. He closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep. At 3 in the morning, the silence broke. James cried. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was the desperate, confused wail of a creature that didn't understand the world. Elias opened his eyes. The fire had died down to embers again. He could see Clara's silhouette sitting up on the bed. She was unbuttoning her dress, getting ready to nurse. Elias didn't turn around. He stared at the glowing orange light on the floorboards. "Is he all right?" Elias asked. His voice was a low rumble in the dark. "He's fine," Clara whispered back. "Just hungry." The crying stopped, replaced by the quiet, rhythmic sounds of feeding. Elias lay there. The silence stretched. It was heavy. It pressed down on him. He found himself asking a question he had no business asking. "Did you name him before he was born or after?" It was a strange question, to ask in the dark, to a stranger. "Before," Clara answered softly. "My husband chose it. He wanted James, if it was a boy." "It's a good name," Elias said. "He didn't live to meet him." Elias closed his eyes. The floor was hard under his shoulder. "I know that kind of loss," he said. He didn't say "I'm sorry." He didn't offer pity. Pity was cheap. Truth wasn't. Clara didn't ask him to explain. She just sat in the dark, feeding her son, feeling for the first time in weeks that she wasn't completely alone in her grief. Morning came with the sound of jingling harnesses and shouting. Elias was already up. He was at the stove, boiling coffee. The door rattled, then banged open. Ruth Abernathy walked in. She was 62, built like a brick oven, wrapped in a buffalo coat. She brought the cold in with her, and she brought a presence that took up the whole room. "He told me he had a situation," Ruth barked, dusting snow off her shoulders. "Comes to my place at 5 in the morning, wakes my dogs like he hasn't been living like a damn hermit bear for 2 years. She looked at the bed. She saw Clara. She saw the baby. Ruth stopped. Her loud demeanor vanished. Her face softened into something completely different. "Oh my," Ruth breathed. She walked over to the bed. "How old?" 3 weeks, Clara said. She was sitting up, pulling the blanket tight. Ruth held out her hands. "Let me hold him." Clara hesitated. She hadn't let anyone hold James, not since he was born. But she looked at Ruth, looked at the absolute grounded certainty in the older woman's eyes. Clara handed him over. Ruth cradled the baby expertly. She checked his color, felt his cheeks. "He's strong," she declared. "You did well, Mama." Ruth looked at Elias. He was pouring coffee, deliberately looking away. "Elias," Ruth said, "go check my rig. The near side trace is loose. My horse is getting spooky." "I just made coffee," Elias muttered. "The coffee will be there. Go." Elias set the pot down. He grabbed his coat and walked out. Ruth watched the door close. She looked back at Clara. "You bathe. I brought hot water from my place in jugs, wrapped in blankets. It's still warm. You sleep. I'll watch the boy." "I can't ask you." "You didn't ask. I'm telling." Ruth smiled. It was a kind smile. "Elias bought this land 2 years ago. Worst piece of dirt in the valley. I asked him why. He said he didn't need good dirt. People don't buy bad land unless they don't plan on sticking around, or unless they want a place nobody will ever look for them." Clara looked toward the window, out at the snow. "He took you in," Ruth said softly. "That means he's deciding to stick around." An hour later, Ruth had to step out to fetch more firewood. She didn't put James on the bed. Elias had just walked back in, dusting snow from his hat. Ruth walked over to him. She held out the baby. "Hold him," Ruth said. "I don't—" "Hold him, Elias." Ruth didn't wait. She deposited the bundle into his large, awkward arms and walked out the door. Elias stood in the middle of his cabin, alone with a 3-week-old baby. James looked up. His eyes were that milky, unfocused blue of newborns. He wasn't crying. He was just looking. Elias didn't breathe. His hands, which could rope a wild steer or draw a gun in half a second, felt clumsy, useless. But his body remembered. Instinct pushed through the fog of grief. He tucked his elbow in, supported the neck, held the baby close to the steady beat of his heart. James reached out a tiny, erratic hand. His fingers brushed Elias's coat. Then he found Elias's index finger, and he gripped it. It was a reflex. Elias knew that. But the tiny pressure on his finger felt like a mountain sitting on his chest. In the locked drawer beside his bed, there was a tiny blue yarn sock. Only one. The second had never been finished. He hadn't thought about that sock in years, not willingly. He stared at the baby. He spoke to the empty room. "I don't know what to do with you," he whispered. James just held on to the finger. When Clara woke up a few hours later, the cabin was quiet. The fire was popping. She sat up. In the corner of the room near the stove was a wooden box. It wasn't a crate. It was sanded down, lined with heavy, clean blankets, a makeshift crib. Elias was sitting at the table, running an oiled cloth over the barrel of his Winchester rifle. Clara looked at the crib, then at him. "When did you make that?" she asked. "You slept a few hours," he said, not looking up from the gun. "I know how long I slept. I asked when you made it." Elias paused. "About an hour ago." Clara swung her legs out of the bed. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She walked over to the table and sat opposite him. "You need to know why I'm running," Clara said. Elias set the rag down. He looked at her. "You don't owe me a story." "You are hiding me," Clara said firmly. "You don't even know what you're hiding me from. You need to know so you can decide if you want to keep doing it." Elias looked at her face, the stubborn set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. "All right," Elias said. "Tell me." The fire crackled. The wind beat against the logs. Clara told him. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She laid out the facts like a surveyor laying out a property line. She told him about Thomas, a good man, but weak. Weak for whiskey, weak for cards. She told him about the debts piling up like winter snow. And she told him about the man holding the paper on those debts, Harlan Voss. Elias didn't react to the name. Not outwardly. His face remained carved stone, but his eyes went completely still. Clara explained the contract. Thomas had signed over the deed to their land in exchange for a loan to cover his gambling markers. But there was a clause Thomas hadn't read or hadn't understood. "They called it dependent property," Clara said, her voice bitter. "Voss's lawyer explained it to me after Thomas died. He broke his neck falling off a horse. I was 8 months pregnant. The lawyer said that because Thomas signed the contract before the baby was born, the unborn child was considered part of the household assets, collateral." Elias leaned forward. The old marshal in him woke up. His mind shifted from the emotional weight of a crying baby to the cold logic of a case. "Do you have a copy of that contract?" Elias asked. "Thomas kept the copy. I couldn't find it after he died." "Did Voss say exactly what he wanted?" "He wants James," Clara said. Her hands tightened into fists on the table. "He said he was taking the child to liquidate the asset, to square the debt." Elias sat back. He stared at the ceiling. "That is legal nonsense," Elias said flatly, "even in this territory. But if nobody challenges it in front of a real judge, then it becomes the truth," Clara finished for him. "I know." Elias stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the blowing snow. He knew Harlan Voss. He knew the type. Voss wasn't a bank robber. He didn't use guns if he could use a pen. He used lawyers. He used fine print. He used the law as a weapon to bludgeon people who couldn't read the words they were signing. And Elias knew something else. Voss didn't want a baby. A baby was a liability, an expense. "Where is your husband's land?" Elias asked, turning back to her. "West edge of the valley." "Why?" Elias nodded slowly. "There's an underground aquifer there. I saw the survey maps when I bought this place. Whoever controls that land controls the water for 30 ranches west of town." Clara's eyes widened. "Thomas didn't know that." "Voss knew," Elias said. "That's why he targeted your husband. And right now, the only legal heir to that land is sitting in a wooden box by my stove. If Voss controls the heir, he controls the land." He let the truth hang in the air. Clara looked at the crib. The betrayal of her husband's weakness was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. They hadn't just been unlucky. They had been hunted. Elias put his hat on. "I need some air." He walked out onto the porch. The wind had died down a bit, but the cold was still bitter. He leaned against the porch rail. He had nothing to fight Voss with. He had no badge, no jurisdiction. He had 400 acres of dirt and a few cows. He was one man against a machine of money and influence. Walk away, his brain told him. Put her on a wagon to Fort Steele. Let it be someone else's problem. He looked at his hands. He could still feel the phantom pressure of the baby's tiny fingers gripping him. He heard the sound of snow crunching before he saw the rider. A man on a big bay horse trotted up to the fence line. He was wrapped in a thick drover's coat. He pulled the horse up short. Elias didn't move from the porch. "Mr. Cole," the rider called out. His voice was polite, too polite. Elias knew him. Dale Pruitt, Voss's right-hand man. He wasn't a sheriff, he wasn't a lawyer. He was the muscle that made sure the lawyer's papers got signed. "Pruitt," Elias said. "Cold day to be standing on the porch," Pruitt said with a smile. He didn't dismount. "I was sent out this way to ask about a woman. And a baby. Someone reported seeing tracks heading toward your property last night." Elias stood perfectly still. He didn't look back at the cabin. "Haven't seen anyone," Elias said. His voice was flat, empty. Pruitt's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're new to this valley, Mr. Cole. Maybe you don't understand how things work here. Mr. Harlan Voss is a very important man in Sweetwater County. He has a legal claim on that child, a signed contract. Keeping a good relationship with Mr. Voss is wise." Pruitt patted his saddlebag, making sure Elias knew he had the papers and the gun under his coat. Elias looked Pruitt up and down. "I haven't seen anyone," Elias repeated. The exact same tone, the exact same cadence. Pruitt stared at him for a long, silent moment. The wind whipped between them. Pruitt realized he was talking to a wall, a very dangerous wall. "All right, Mr. Cole," Pruitt said. He tipped his hat. "I'll let Mr. Voss know." Pruitt turned his horse and rode back down the trail, disappearing into the white. Elias waited until the tracks were just shadows in the snow. Then he turned and walked back inside. Clara was standing right by the door. She had heard everything. "You lied for me," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization. Elias took off his hat and knocked the snow off it against his leg. "I don't have anyone on my property that Dale Pruitt needs to know about." "It's still a lie," she said. "You're a man of the law, or you were. And you just lied to a man holding a legal contract." Elias walked over to the stove. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He took a sip. It was bitter. He turned to face her. "Mrs. Reed, we need to get something straight," Elias said. The conversational tone was gone. He was speaking with the authority of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer. "Law without compassion is just licensed violence," Elias said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Men like Voss, they use ink and paper to turn a human child into a ledger entry. They use the law to steal." He took a step closer. The sheer size of him seemed to fill the small cabin. "But there isn't a piece of paper in this territory," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave full of quiet fury, "that supersedes a mother's right to hold her son. True justice doesn't live in Harlan Voss's desk drawer. It lives in the truth." Clara stood her ground. "Voss won't stop. He has the sheriff. He has the judge. If you keep me here, you're going to lose this farm. You're going to lose everything." "I've lost everything before," Elias said. "It doesn't scare me anymore." "Why?" Clara demanded. Her voice finally cracked. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." Elias reached inside his heavy coat. He dug into the breast pocket. He pulled something out and tossed it onto the wooden table. It landed with a heavy clink, a tarnished silver star, Deputy U.S. Marshal. Clara looked at the badge, then up at him. "I spent a lot of years enforcing the law," Elias said quietly. "And I watched rich men walk free while poor men hanged. I walked away because I couldn't stomach it anymore." He looked at the makeshift crib. "I'm not doing this for the law," Elias said. "I'm doing this because for the first time in 5 years I'm looking at something right. And I won't let the wolves take it." Clara looked at the badge shining dull in the firelight. Then she looked at Elias. The frozen, guarded woman she had been on the trail was melting away. She realized, terrifyingly, that she was trusting him. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Elias said, picking up the badge and slipping it back into his pocket, "we get ready for a fight." 3 days passed. The snow didn't stop. It wasn't a flurry. It was a siege. The Sweetwater Valley was buried under a heavy, suffocating white blanket. The wind battered the log walls of the cabin day and night. Inside, a strange routine settled over the three of them. Elias woke before dawn. He stoked the fire. He bundled up and went out into the blinding dark to feed the stock. He came back smelling of cold air and hay. Clara took over the cooking. She didn't ask. She just did it. Elias had been living on hardtack, dried beans, and salt pork. Clara found a sack of flour he had forgotten about, some dried apples, and rendered fat. She made biscuits. She made thick stews. Elias didn't offer compliments. He wasn't a man for empty praise, but he ate everything she put in front of him, and he stopped trying to do it himself. That was a concession. For Elias Cole, it was a massive one. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Elias came in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway, stomping the snow from his boots. Clara was sitting by the stove. James was asleep in his wooden box. Clara had a heavy leather harness draped across her lap. It was an old rig. A strap had snapped a month ago. Elias had tossed it in the corner, meaning to get to it. Clara had an awl in one hand and a thick waxed thread in the other. She was pushing the needle through the tough leather. Her stitches were tight, even, strong. Elias took off his hat. He hung it on the peg. "You don't need to do that," he said. Clara didn't look up. She pulled the thread taut. "Idle hands make a heavy mind, Mr. Cole. Besides, I know how to mend leather." Elias walked over. He looked at the stitches. They were better than his. "Where'd you learn?" he asked. "Ohio," Clara said. "My father was a school teacher, but my grandfather was a saddle maker. I spent my summers in his shop. He said a woman who couldn't fix her own tack was at the mercy of the man who rode with her. She tied off the thread, snapped it with her teeth. She set the harness aside and stood up. She walked over to the far wall. Elias had a map pinned there, a rough, hand-drawn survey of the Wyoming Territory. Clara had been staring at it for 3 days. "This is the Sweetwater Valley," she said, tracing a line with her finger. "But it's incomplete. The proportions are wrong." Elias walked up behind her. He kept his distance, but he looked at where she was pointing. "Surveyors only came through in '76, Elias said. "They mapped the claims, ignored the empty spaces. My husband's land is here," she pointed to the western edge. "It's good land, but Thomas couldn't make it yield. He said it was cursed, dry on top, rock underneath." Elias stared at the map. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. "It's not cursed," Elias said quietly. "It's just hiding." Clara turned to look at him. "Hiding what?" "Water," Elias said. "There's an underground aquifer. I saw the geological charts in Cheyenne before I bought my parcel. Your husband's land sits right on top of the main artery. Whoever controls that acreage controls the water rights for 30 ranches west of the ridge." Clara went perfectly still. The pieces fell into place. Thomas hadn't just been a mark for a gambling debt. He had been a target. Harlan Voss didn't want the land to graze cattle. He wanted the land to strangle the valley. "Thomas didn't know," Clara whispered. "No, he didn't." Clara turned back to the map. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden table. Her knuckles went white. The anger wasn't hot. It was cold. Cold and sharp as the wind outside. She turned around. She looked Elias dead in the eye. "They taught us women how to read books and calculate numbers," Clara said. Her voice was trembling, but not from fear. It was pure, distilled outrage. "They let us study history. They let us learn the world. But they denied us the right to sign our own names to our own lives." Elias stood silent. He let her speak. She needed to. "They call it protection," Clara continued, her voice rising, filling the cabin. "The law says a husband protects his wife's interests. I call it a gilded cage. Voss knew my husband was weak. He knew Thomas would gamble away a fortune he didn't understand. And the law let him do it." She stepped closer to Elias. She wasn't yelling at him. She was yelling at the world, and he was the only one there to hear it. "A civilized society cannot treat women and children as appendages to a deed of land," Clara said, pronouncing every word with heavy, deliberate force. "We are human beings. We are not property. My son is not collateral for a hand of poker. He is a life." Elias held her gaze. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a platitude. "You're right," Elias said simply. "You're right, and the law is wrong." The fight drained out of Clara as quickly as it had flared. She let out a shaky breath. She leaned against the table, suddenly exhausted. That night, the exhaustion took its toll. It was near midnight. The wind was hammering the roof. Clara had been pacing the floor for an hour. James was fussy. He wasn't crying, but he wouldn't sleep. He squirmed and grunted, fighting the swaddle. Clara was swaying on her feet. Shadows like bruises hung under her eyes. Elias was sitting in his chair by the stove. He had a worn, leather-bound book open on his lap. He had been reading the same page for 20 minutes. He closed the book. He stood up. He walked over to Clara. He didn't ask. He just held out his hands. "Give him to me," Elias said. Clara pulled back an inch. "I have him. He's just unsettled." "You're dead on your feet," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "You drop him, we both lose. Give him to me." Clara looked at Elias's massive hands. Then she looked at his face. The hardness was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid patience. She handed James over. Elias took the baby. He didn't hold him out at arm's length anymore. He tucked James right against his chest, sliding one massive hand up to support the fragile neck. He walked back to his chair. He sat down. He leaned back, letting the baby rest entirely on his chest. Elias picked up his book with his free hand and opened it. Clara stood in the middle of the room. She watched. Elias didn't rock him, he didn't shush him. He just sat there breathing. Deep, slow, even breaths. The slow, rhythmic thud of Elias's heart against the baby's ear did what an hour of pacing couldn't. Within 4 minutes, James went completely limp, fast asleep. Elias didn't move to put him in the crib. He just kept reading, or pretending to read. Clara walked quietly into the bedroom area. But she left the curtain open. She lay down on the bed and watched the firelight dance across Elias Cole. A hardened ex-lawman sitting perfectly still, holding a newborn so he wouldn't wake up. It was the safest she had felt in her entire life. The next morning, the storm broke. The sun came out blindingly bright against the fresh snow. The world outside was perfectly still. Clara and Elias were sitting at the table. They were churning a small batch of butter in a wooden crock. They passed the heavy wooden plunger back and forth. It was a rhythmic, quiet chore. Clara pushed the plunger down. She looked at Elias's hands holding the crock steady. "You said you knew this kind of loss," Clara said softly. Elias didn't tense, but his breathing slowed. "You lost someone before you met them," Clara pressed gently. "You lost your wife and your child." Elias took the plunger from her. He pushed it down into the thick cream. Up, down. "5 years ago," Elias said, "in Kansas." Clara didn't say, "I'm sorry." She knew he didn't want to hear it. "What was her name?" Clara asked. Elias stopped churning. He stared down into the wooden crock. For 5 years, people had asked him what happened. They asked if he was okay. They asked if he caught the guy. Nobody had asked her name. Elias swallowed hard. The word felt like broken glass in his throat, but he forced it out. "Margaret," he whispered. He looked up towards the frosted window. "People tried to call her Maggie," Elias said, his voice thick. "I never did. I liked Margaret. She said it sounded more careful. Maggie is what you yell when you're in a hurry. Margaret is what you say when you're looking right at someone." Clara nodded slowly. Thomas had called her Claire because it was faster. "Did you know?" Clara asked. "Boy or girl?" "No," Elias said. "It wasn't time yet." "Did you have a name?" Elias pushed the plunger down again. He focused on the motion. "Thomas," Elias said. "For her father, if it was a boy." Clara stopped breathing for a second. Thomas. That was why he had paused in the dark the first night. That was why he had said it was a good name. She reached across the table. She didn't grab his hand. She just laid her fingers gently on his wrist, a simple anchor in the present. Elias looked at her hand. Then he looked at her face. Before either of them could speak, the heavy wooden door of the cabin shook with 3 loud, frantic knocks. Elias stood up instantly. The tender moment vanished. The marshal was back. He grabbed the Winchester from the table. He stepped to the side of the door and pulled the latch. It was Ruth. She stumbled inside, covered in snow, breathing hard. She didn't bother taking her coat off. She looked at Elias, then at Clara. "Voss made his move," Ruth gasped, leaning on the table. "He went to Sheriff Morrison this morning. He has a court order." The cabin suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. Elias bolted the door shut. He set the rifle down. "Explain," he said. Ruth pulled off her heavy mittens. Her hands were shaking. "Judge Harmon signed it an hour ago. Voss had his lawyer draw it up. It's an order of enforcement. It demands Clara present herself and the child at the courthouse in Sweetwater within 7 days." "And if she doesn't?" Clara asked, her voice tight. "Then they issue a bench warrant for your arrest," Ruth said grimly, "for refusal to execute a legal contract. The sheriff will be legally obligated to drag you in." "They can't arrest a mother for keeping her own child," Clara said, stepping forward. "They can do whatever they want when they own the judge," Ruth shot back. "This is the frontier, Clara. Harlan Voss has enough money to make legal and right two very different things. Elias was pacing. His mind was working through the angles. They don't want to arrest her, Elias muttered, mostly to himself. An arrest brings attention. It brings a trial. Voss doesn't want a trial over a baby. He wants the pressure. He wants her to surrender the boy quietly to avoid a cage. Elias stopped pacing. He looked at Clara. "Do you have anything?" Elias demanded. "Any paper, any letter, anything Thomas left behind?" "I told you," Clara said, her voice rising in panic. "I couldn't find his copy of the deed." "Think!" Elias stepped closer, his voice hard. "Men like Thomas hide things when they're scared. Where would he put it?" Clara closed her eyes. She pressed her palms to her temples. She walked back through the awful days after Thomas died, packing her bags, the funeral, the men coming for the furniture. She opened her eyes. "His coat," she whispered. She ran to the far corner of the room where her travel bag sat. She dropped to her knees and tore the buckles open. She pulled out a heavy, dark wool coat. It smelled of stale tobacco and old sweat. "I took it," Clara said, frantically running her hands over the fabric. "I don't know why. I just couldn't leave it in that empty house." Elias knelt beside her. "Check the lining." Clara felt along the seams. She stopped near the left breast. "Here," she gasped. "The stitching is thick." Elias pulled a small knife from his belt. He handed it to her. It was her husband's coat. It was her right to cut it. Clara took the knife. She sliced the heavy thread. She reached into the dark opening and pulled out a folded piece of thick parchment. She handed it to Elias. Elias stood up. He walked to the window to catch the afternoon light. He unfolded the paper. It was cracked at the creases. He read it. He read it again. His face didn't change, but the muscle in his jaw jumped. "What is it?" Ruth asked, stepping up beside him. "It's the original deed," Elias said. "Signed by Voss, signed by Thomas Reed." Elias set the paper on the table. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the center paragraph. "Read that," Elias said to Clara. Clara leaned over. She read the legal jargon. She frowned. It just says the land transfers upon default. There's nothing here about dependent property. There's nothing about my son." Elias looked at her. "Exactly. I don't understand." "Voss altered his copy," Elias said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "He added the clause about the baby after Thomas signed it. He forged a legal document to steal an inheritance." Ruth gasped. "That's a felony." "It's fraud," Elias said. "Federal fraud." "Then we take it to the sheriff," Clara said, a surge of hope lighting up her face. "No," Elias said flatly. He rolled the paper back up. "Judge Harmon is on Voss's payroll. If we give this to the local law, it accidentally falls in a fire. We need a real judge." "Circuit Judge Caldwell," Ruth said, nodding slowly. "He rides through Sweetwater once a quarter. Caldwell can't be bought. He hates Voss." "When is he due?" Elias asked. "Mid-January," Ruth said. Clara's face fell. "My order expires in 7 days. They'll come for me by the end of December. We have to survive 3 weeks." "We will," Elias said. He walked back to the table to look at the document again. He wanted to make sure he had the dates right. He scanned the signatures at the bottom. Harlan Voss, Thomas Reed, and beneath that the signature of the witness, the man who had co-signed the loan for Thomas. Elias froze. The blood drained from his face. The room seemed to tilt sideways. The roaring of the wind outside was suddenly drowned out by a ringing in his ears. Carver Reed. Elias stared at the ink. He felt the cold iron of a badge he hadn't worn in 5 years pressing against his chest. He felt the rain of a Kansas night. He heard the gunfire. "Elias," Clara asked. She saw his face. "Elias, what is it?" Elias didn't look at her. He couldn't. He turned around. He walked to the door, threw the bolt back, and walked out into the freezing cold without his coat. Clara grabbed her shawl and ran after him. Ruth followed. Elias was standing in the snow, a dozen yards from the porch. His back was to them. He was staring at the tree line, breathing heavy, ragged breaths. Clara stopped a few feet behind him. "Elias, talk to me." He didn't turn around. When he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "Abilene," Elias said. 1873. Clara frowned. "What?" Elias finally turned. His eyes were wild, haunted. "I told you I lost my wife in Kansas," Elias said. "I didn't tell you how." Clara hugged her shawl tighter against the wind. She waited. "I was a marshal," Elias said. "I was hunting a gun runner, a man moving stolen army rifles through the territory. We cornered him in an alley. There was a shootout. It was dark. It was raining." Elias swallowed. He looked down at the snow. "Margaret was walking home from the seamstress," he whispered. "She was at the end of the street. A stray bullet hit her. She died before she hit the ground." Clara covered her mouth. "Oh, God." "The man backing the gun runner," Elias said, looking up at Clara, his eyes burning with a terrible dark fire. "The man funding the whole operation was Harlan Voss." Clara stumbled back a step. "Voss fled town before I could get a warrant," Elias said. "But we caught the gun runner, the man pulling the trigger in that alley." Elias pointed a shaking finger at the cabin, at the deed on the table. "His name," Elias said, his voice cracking, "was Carver Reed." The wind howled across the yard. Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. Carver Reed, Thomas's older brother, the black sheep of the family. The man Thomas never spoke of. "My husband's brother," Clara whispered. "Yes," Elias said. "The man who put the bullet in my wife. Your family." Elias turned away from her. He looked out at the vast, empty plains. He had brought his wife's killer's bloodline into his own home. He had fed them. He had held that baby against his chest. He felt sick. He felt a rage he thought he had buried 5 years ago, clawing its way back up his throat. Clara stood frozen in the snow. The tears finally came. Not from the cold, from the absolute crushing cruelty of fate. "I didn't know," Clara sobbed, her pride breaking. "Elias, I swear to God, I didn't know." She turned to walk away, to go pack her bags, to take her baby out into the storm and die. Because she couldn't stay here, not now. "Stop right there," a loud voice cracked like a whip. Ruth marched down the steps. She ignored the cold. She walked straight up to Elias and grabbed him by the shoulder, spinning him around to face her. "Elias Cole, you look at me," Ruth demanded. Elias glared at her, his jaw locked tight. Ruth didn't flinch. She pointed a finger right at his chest. "Misplaced punishment is just another kind of crime," Ruth said. She didn't yell. She spoke with absolute, unwavering authority. "You are hurting, Elias. You have every right to hurt, but you listen to me clearly." She pointed at Clara, who was weeping in the snow. "That woman did not pull a trigger in Abilene," Ruth stated. "And the baby sleeping in your cabin carries no sins of his uncle. He carries no blood debt." Elias clenched his fists. "He is a Reed." "He is a baby," Ruth fired back. Ruth took a step closer to Elias, forcing him to look her in the eyes. "True fairness," Ruth said, pronouncing the words so they cut through the howling wind, "is judging a person by their own actions, not by their bloodline, not by the pasts of the men around them. You want to be a man of the law, Elias? Then you apply the law equally. You protect the innocent, period." Elias stared at the older woman. The rage in his chest fought a violent battle with the truth she was forcing down his throat. He looked at Clara. She was shivering violently, wrapping her arms around herself, expecting to be cast out into the freezing hell. Elias closed his eyes. He took a long, shuddering breath of freezing air. He let it out slowly. The marshal won. Elias opened his eyes. He walked past Ruth. He walked up to Clara. He reached out and grabbed her by the arm, not roughly, firmly. "Get inside," Elias said gruffly, "before you freeze to death." Clara looked up at him through her tears. "You want me to stay?" "I said we're going to fight Voss," Elias said, his voice dropping to a steady, unbreakable timbre. "And I don't break my word. Now get inside the damn cabin." He guided her up the steps. When they got inside, Elias didn't go to the fire. He walked straight to the small dresser next to his bed. He pulled a key from his pocket. He unlocked the bottom drawer. He reached in and pulled out a tiny, unfinished blue yarn sock. Clara and Ruth watched him in silence. Elias didn't put it back. He walked over to the mantel above the cast-iron stove. He set the blue sock down, right in the open, next to the coffee tin, where he would have to look at it every single day. He turned around to face the women. 3 weeks, Elias said. Voss comes for this house. He comes through me. The wagon wheels cut deep into the rutted snow. Sweetwater was a town built on mud and miners' dreams. Now it was just frozen dirt. A single main street lined with false front buildings. A bank, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a church. Elias Cole drove the team. Clara sat beside him on the buckboard. She held James tight against her chest, wrapped in 2 layers of wool. It was mid-morning. The sky was a pale, aching blue, cold and clear. People were on the boardwalks. They stopped walking. They stopped talking. They just watched. Nobody saw Elias Cole in town unless he needed supplies, and nobody had ever seen him riding next to a woman. Clara felt the eyes on them. "They're looking," she murmured. "Let them look," Elias said. He didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the road. He pulled the wagon up to the blacksmith's forge at the end of town. The ring of a heavy hammer on an anvil echoed out into the street. It was a good, honest sound. Elias stepped down and tied off the horses. He helped Clara down. Nate Birch stepped out of the dark heat of the forge. He was a mountain of a man, chest like a rain barrel, hands like cured hams. He wiped soot from his brow with a greasy rag. Nate looked at Elias, then he looked at Clara, then at the bundle in her arms. Nate didn't ask questions. He threw the rag over his shoulder. He walked up to Elias and grabbed his hand. He shook it hard. "Been a long time, Elias." "Too long, Nate." "Come inside, away from the street." The forge was hot, smelled of coal fire and melting iron. It felt like life. Elias laid it out, fast and clean. He told Nate about the boy. He told him about Voss. He told him about the forged contract. Nate leaned against his anvil. He crossed his massive arms. "Voss owns this town, Elias," Nate said. His voice was a deep rumble over the popping coals. "He owns the bank. He holds the paper on half the ranches out west. People are scared. They owe him money. They owe him favors." "I don't need favors," Elias said. "I need the truth, and I need a judge." "Judge Harmon drinks Voss's whiskey," Nate said. "I know. I'm waiting for Caldwell." Nate nodded slowly. "Caldwell is a straight shooter, but he ain't due for weeks. You gotta survive Voss until then." "That's why I'm here," Elias said. "I need to see Morrison." Nate grimaced. "Sheriff Morrison is a tired man, Elias. Voss has him boxed in. You push him, he might just break the wrong way." "I'm going to push him anyway." Elias left Clara by the warm fire with Nate. He walked back out into the biting cold. He crossed the street to the sheriff's office. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and walked in. Sheriff Morrison was sitting behind a scarred pine desk. He looked 50 but was probably 40. Gray hair, gray skin, exhausted eyes. He had a cup of coffee in his hand. He set it down when Elias walked in. "Elias Cole," Morrison said. He didn't sound happy. "Sheriff." Elias walked to the desk. He didn't sit in the empty chair. He stood, forcing Morrison to look up at him. "I know about the court order," Elias said. "I know Voss wants you to ride out to my place and drag Clara Reed in." Morrison sighed. He rubbed a hand over his face. "It's a legal order, Elias. Judge Harmon signed it. I don't have a choice." "You always have a choice," Elias said. His voice was low, hard. "Damn it, Elias. You used to wear a badge. You know how this works. The paper says fetch. I fetch." Elias leaned forward. He planted both hands flat on Morrison's desk. "I know exactly how it works," Elias said. The rhythm of his words was steady, like a drum beat. "I also know Voss forged that contract. He added a clause to steal a baby so he could steal a water right. It's a federal crime." Morrison looked away. He looked out the window toward the bank. "I can't prove that," Morrison muttered. "Not in front of Harmon." "I'm not asking you to prove it. I'm asking you to wait. Wait for Judge Caldwell. Voss will ruin me. He'll take my pension. He'll run me out of town." Elias stared at him. The pity he felt was buried under a mountain of disgust. "Morrison, silence in the face of injustice is complicity," Elias said. The words hung in the dusty air of the office. Clear, unmistakable. Morrison flinched. "That tin star on your chest," Elias continued, pointing a thick finger at the sheriff's badge, "isn't just there to enforce orders from the wealthy. It's there to protect the voiceless. If we let Voss take this child today, tomorrow, he will take the soul of this entire valley." Morrison swallowed hard. He looked down at his desk. "Equality begins only when the strongest among us stand up to shield the weakest," Elias said. He straightened up. "You come to my cabin, Sheriff. You better come heavy, because I won't let you take them." Elias turned and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't need to. He walked back toward the forge. But halfway there, a voice called out. "Mr. Cole!" Elias stopped. He turned slowly. Harlan Voss was standing on the boardwalk in front of the bank. He was wearing a tailored wool suit, a silk cravat. He looked clean. He looked rich. Beside him stood his lawyer, Beaumont, a small, nervous man carrying a leather satchel. Voss stepped down into the frozen mud of the street. He smiled. It was a polite, terrifying smile. "I heard you were in town," Voss said. "I trust Mrs. Reed is doing well?" Elias didn't move. "She's fine." "That's wonderful news," Voss said smoothly. "I worry about her. The frontier is no place for a single mother. She needs proper care. The child needs proper care." "They have it." Voss's smile tightened, just a fraction. "Mr. Cole, you are a man of the world. You understand how debts work. Thomas Reed owed me a substantial sum. He signed a contract. I am simply executing my legal rights." At that moment, Clara stepped out of the forge. Nate Birch stepped out right behind her. Clara held James tight. She looked across the street at the man who had ruined her husband. She didn't shrink back. She stepped off the boardwalk. She stood beside Elias. Voss looked at her. "Clara, please, be reasonable. Bring the boy to the bank. We can settle this quietly." Clara looked at him. Her gray eyes were like flint. "I have nothing to settle with you, Mr. Voss," Clara said. Her voice carried down the quiet street. "I am not your property. My son is not your collateral." Voss sighed. He looked at Beaumont. Then he looked at Elias. "You're making a mistake, Elias," Voss said. The polite veneer was cracking. The wolf was showing its teeth. "You are harboring a fugitive. You are interfering with a lawful court order. You will lose that little dirt farm of yours, and you will go to prison." Elias looked Voss up and down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Come and take her," Elias said. It was a challenge. Simple. Absolute. Voss stared at him. He saw the cold, dead certainty in Elias's eyes. Voss wasn't a man who fought his own battles. He bought men to do that. "We will see you very soon, Mr. Cole," Voss said. He turned and walked back into the bank. Beaumont scurried after him. Elias looked at Clara. She was breathing hard, but she was standing tall. "Let's go home," Elias said. As they walked back to the wagon, Reverend Oakes stepped out from the alley beside the church. He was an older man, flimsy. He looked like the wind could blow him over. "Mr. Cole," the Reverend whispered. He looked around nervously. "Mrs. Reed." Elias stopped. "Reverend." Oakes wrung his hands. "I heard what happened. I heard you standing up to him. I have buried too many men who crossed Harlan Voss. I have sat by and watched him take farms from good people." "And you prayed for them," Elias said flatly. "I did," Oakes said, shame coloring his cheeks. "But prayers without courage are just empty words. If Judge Caldwell comes, I have a ledger. I kept a ledger of every family Voss ruined, every dirty trick. I will give it to the judge. I will testify." Elias looked at the frail preacher. It was a crack in the dam, a small one, but a crack. "Keep it hidden, Reverend," Elias said, "until I send for you." They got in the wagon. Elias snapped the reins. They rode out of Sweetwater. The lines were drawn. The silence was broken. Now all they had to do was survive the siege. The deadline hit. It was the 28th of December. The 7 days were up. The wind had died down, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the storm. The moon was a silver coin pinned to a black sky. The snow glowed blue in the dark. Inside the cabin, the fire burned hot. Elias hadn't slept in 2 days. He sat in his chair by the stove. His Winchester rested across his knees. The hammer was down, but the chamber was loaded. He had a box of extra shells on the table. Clara sat on the bed. James was asleep in his box. Ruth was there, too. She had ridden over that afternoon with a shotgun wrapped in a blanket. Elias had told her to go home. Ruth had told him to go to hell. She was sitting at the table, calmly knitting a thick wool sock. "They'll come tonight," Elias said. He didn't look away from the window. "Voss won't come himself," Ruth said, not missing a stitch. "He doesn't like the cold. He'll send Pruitt." "Pruitt brings men," Elias noted. "Let him," Clara said. Elias looked back at her. She wasn't shaking. The fear that had gripped her a week ago was gone. It had burned away, leaving something hard and pure behind. It was past midnight when the dogs started barking at Ruth's farm, 6 miles away. Elias heard it, a faint, rhythmic echo across the frozen valley. He stood up. He walked to the lantern hanging on the wall and blew it out. The cabin plunged into darkness, lit only by the red glow of the stove grates. "Stay away from the windows," Elias ordered softly. He stepped to the heavy wooden door. He slid the iron bolt back but didn't open it. He waited. 10 minutes later, he heard the crunch of hooves on frozen snow. Then the snorts of horses, the creak of saddle leather. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted him to know they were there. Intimidation was half the game. Elias cracked the door open an inch. 5 men, mounted. They carried coal oil lanterns that swung from their saddles, casting long, jumping shadows across the yard. Dale Pruitt was in front. He rode a big gray horse. He pulled up right at the edge of the porch light. He had a piece of paper in his hand. He had a 6-shooter strapped to his hip. The men behind him held rifles. "Elias Cole!" Pruitt shouted. His voice echoed off the trees. "Open the door!" Elias opened the door. He stepped out onto the porch. He didn't raise the Winchester. He just held it loose in his right hand, the barrel pointing at the floorboards. But his finger was inside the trigger guard. The cold hit him instantly. He didn't shiver. "You're trespassing, Pruitt," Elias said. His voice was calm. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Pruitt urged his horse a half-step forward. He held up the paper. "I have a bench warrant, Cole, signed by Judge Harmon. Clara Reed is in contempt of a legal order. I am authorized to take her into custody, and the child." "Authorized by who?" Elias asked. "You don't wear a badge." "I am an appointed agent of the court," Pruitt sneered. "Now step aside, or you're obstructing justice." Elias didn't move an inch. "There's no justice here," Elias said. Just a rich man sending a dog to steal a baby. Pruitt's face darkened. He dropped the paper into his saddlebag. He rested his right hand on the butt of his pistol. The four men behind him shifted, rifles lifted slightly. "We are taking them, Cole," Pruitt said. His voice was deadly quiet now. "One way or the other. You want to die for a woman you met a week ago? A woman who carries the name of the man who killed your wife?" Elias felt the punch of those words. Voss had done his digging. Voss knew about Carver Reed. Voss thought it was a wedge he could drive right through Elias's heart. Elias felt the anger flare, hot and bright. But he didn't let it blind him. He took one step forward, just one. He brought the Winchester up. He didn't point it at Pruitt. He racked the lever. The mechanical clack-clack was the loudest sound in the valley. A heavy brass shell flew out. A fresh one slid into the chamber. He pointed the barrel at the snow exactly halfway between the porch and Pruitt's horse. "You crossed that line," Elias said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that carried over the wind. "And you don't go home." Pruitt hesitated. He had 4 men. Elias was one. But Elias was standing in the dark behind solid wood. And Elias was a man who had killed before. Pruitt knew a bluff when he saw one. This wasn't a bluff. Before Pruitt could make a call, the cabin door swung wide open. Elias turned sharply. "Clara, get back!" Clara didn't listen. She stepped out onto the porch. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't cowering. She stepped right to the edge of the steps, standing under the moonlight. In her hand, she held the original folded deed. Pruitt frowned. "Mrs. Reed, make this easy. Hand over the boy." Clara stared down at the men on their horses. She felt the freezing wind cutting through her dress, but she didn't care. The fear was entirely gone. "Harlan Voss!" Clara shouted. She didn't yell at Pruitt. She yelled to the night, knowing Pruitt would carry the message back. "You tell your master," Clara yelled, her voice ringing clear and strong like a church bell. "You might own the bank, but you do not own our morality." Pruitt looked taken aback. His horse danced nervously. "A contract built on deceit and the theft of motherhood is a condemnation of your own soul before God," Clara declared, holding the original deed up in the moonlight. "Your power is nothing but an illusion if it relies entirely on our fear. I am not afraid of you anymore." She pointed the folded paper right at Pruitt. "I have the original deed," Clara said, her voice dropping to a sharp, commanding tone. "The one without the forged clause. I have it. And I'm waiting for Judge Caldwell. If you shoot this man, if you take my child tonight, it won't be a civil dispute. It will be murder. And half the town knows it." Pruitt froze. He looked at the paper in her hand. Voss hadn't told him about an original deed. Voss had said it was a simple extraction. A scared widow and a stubborn farmer. This wasn't simple. Pruitt looked at Elias. Elias had the rifle raised an inch higher now. Pruitt looked at the dark windows of the cabin. He saw the dull gleam of a shotgun barrel resting on the sill. Ruth. It was a bloodbath waiting to happen. And over what? A baby? Pruitt was paid well, but he wasn't paid to die in the snow over a rich man's land grab. Pruitt slowly pulled his hand away from his pistol. "This ain't over, Cole," Pruitt said, but the bite was gone from his voice. "Ride out, Pruitt," Elias said, "while you still can." Pruitt yanked his horse's reins. The animal spun around. He kicked it into a trot. The 4 men behind him lowered their rifles and followed. They rode back down the trail, the lantern light fading into the dark woods. Elias stood on the porch until he couldn't hear the hooves anymore. Only the wind. He slowly lowered the hammer on the Winchester. He turned around. Clara was still standing there. Her hand was shaking now. The adrenaline was leaving her, replaced by the freezing cold. Elias stepped up to her. He didn't say a word. He just took off his heavy buffalo coat and draped it over her shoulders. The coat swallowed her. It was heavy and it was warm. Clara looked up at him. "They'll be back." "Let them," Elias said. He looked out at the snow. For the first time in 5 years, the winter didn't feel like a grave. It felt like a wall A wall he had built, a wall he would hold. He put his hand gently on her shoulder, guiding her back into the warmth of the cabin. "We wait for the judge," Elias said. "We hold the line." The waiting was the hardest part. January crept into the Sweetwater Valley like a starving wolf, cold, slow, merciless. But Elias Cole held the line. Dale Pruitt never came back. Harlan Voss stayed in town, sitting by his coal stove, waiting for the law to do his dirty work. On the 15th of January, the law arrived. It didn't come with a posse. It came in a black federal buggy drawn by two tired roans. Circuit Judge William Caldwell stepped down into the frozen mud of Sweetwater's main street. He was a small man, thin, spectacles resting on the bridge of a sharp nose. He didn't look like much, but he carried the full weight of the United States government in his battered leather briefcase. Elias and Clara were already waiting. They sat on a hard oak bench inside the town's small courthouse. James was wrapped tight in Clara's arms. Nate Birch stood by the door. Ruth Abernathy sat in the back row. The room was packed. Word had spread. The people of Sweetwater had come to watch the wolf finally corner his prey. Harlan Voss sat at the plaintiff's table. He looked relaxed. His lawyer, Beaumont, was arranging papers. Judge Caldwell walked to the front of the room. He didn't use a gavel. He just sat down, took off his spectacles, and wiped them with a handkerchief. The room went dead silent. "I'm not here for a circus," Caldwell said. His voice was thin, but it cut like a razor. "I'm here to clear a docket. Mr. Beaumont, you filed an order of enforcement. Let's hear it." Beaumont stood up. He was slick, practiced. He laid out the case. Thomas Reed owed money. He signed a contract. He died. The widow refused to turn over the collateral. The collateral, he stated flatly, included the dependent child. "We are simply asking the court to uphold a signed legal contract," Beaumont concluded. He handed a piece of paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. Caldwell looked at it. He didn't blink. He looked over at Elias and Clara. "Mrs. Reed, you are represented by Mr. Cole?" Elias stood up. He walked to the center aisle. "I'm not a lawyer, Your Honor. I'm just a man with eyes." Elias reached inside his coat. He pulled out the folded, worn parchment they had found in Thomas's coat. He handed it to the bailiff. "That is the original contract," Elias said. "Found in Thomas Reed's pocket after he died. I'd ask the court to compare the middle paragraph." Caldwell laid the two papers side by side. He put his spectacles back on. He leaned in close. The silence in the room stretched. It felt like a physical weight. Voss shifted in his chair, just a fraction, but Elias saw it. Caldwell sat back. He looked at Voss. "Mr. Voss," Caldwell said, "the ink on this dependent property clause is fresh. The handwriting is yours, but the pressure is different. It was added after the signature." Voss stood up. He smoothed his vest. "Your Honor, that is an outrageous accusation. I run a legitimate bank." "You run a slaughterhouse," a voice called out from the back. Everyone turned. Reverend Oakes stood up. He was trembling. But he stepped out into the aisle. He held a thick, leather-bound ledger in his hands. "For 10 years, the Reverend said, his voice shaking at first, then growing strong. "For 10 years I have buried the men Harlan Voss drove into the dirt. I prayed with the widows he evicted. I kept a record. Every forged deed, every hidden clause, every family he destroyed to take their land." Oakes walked forward. He set the ledger on the judge's desk. "I was a coward, Your Honor," Oakes said, "but I won't be quiet anymore. And I'm not alone." The back doors of the courthouse opened. Sheriff Morrison walked in. Behind him walked 4 farmers, men with weather-beaten faces and calloused hands, men who owed Voss money, men who had been terrified yesterday. Morrison took off his hat. "Judge Caldwell, I'm prepared to testify. Harlan Voss ordered me to execute a fraudulent warrant. He threatened my pension if I didn't comply." Voss's face finally lost its color. He looked at the room, the people he had owned, the people he had crushed. They were staring right back at him, and they weren't blinking. But the wolf wasn't dead yet. Beaumont stood up. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias. "This is a conspiracy," Beaumont shouted. "Your Honor, you are taking the word of a disgraced man. Elias Cole is a former deputy marshal who was stripped of his badge. He is a killer. His negligence caused the death of an innocent woman in Abilene. And the man he was hunting that night? It was Carver Reed, the brother-in-law of the woman he is protecting right now. This is a personal vendetta against Mr. Voss." The room gasped. The ugly truth was out. Elias didn't move. He felt the eyes of the town burning into his back. He felt the old shame rising up in his throat. It was true. He had brought the violence to Abilene. He had failed. "Is this true, Mr. Cole?" Caldwell asked softly. Elias opened his mouth to speak, to take the blame, like he always did. "No." Clara stood up. She handed James to Ruth. She walked up to the bench. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Elias. She didn't look at Voss. She looked right at the judge. "It is a lie, Your Honor," Clara said. Her voice rang out clear and steady. Elias Cole was not disgraced. He resigned, because he couldn't forgive himself for a stray bullet he didn't fire. The man who funded the guns in Abilene was Harlan Voss. She turned and pointed right at Voss. "Harlan Voss, you might own the bank, but you do not own our morality." She stepped closer to the defense table. Voss actually leaned back. "A contract built on deceit and the theft of motherhood is a condemnation of your own soul before God," Clara declared, the rhythm of her words striking like a hammer on an anvil. "Your power is nothing but an illusion if it relies entirely on our fear. And we are not afraid of you anymore." Voss opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Judge Caldwell picked up his wooden gavel. He didn't hit the block. He just rolled it in his hand. He looked at Harlan Voss. Then he looked at Clara Reed. Then he looked out at the crowded room. "Sit down, Mr. Voss," Caldwell ordered. Voss slowly sank into his chair. Caldwell stood up. He leaned over the bench. He didn't speak like a man reading a statute. He spoke like a man laying down the bedrock of civilization. "The laws of the United States do not exist to serve the boundless greed of one individual," Judge Caldwell said. His voice echoed off the wooden walls. Every person in the room heard it. Every person felt it. "Fundamental human rights," Caldwell continued, staring directly at Voss. "The right to freedom, the right to keep a family intact, these are paramount. They are above any ink, any paper, and any bank. Anyone who manipulates legal loopholes to tear a mother from her child is attacking the very foundation of this republic." Caldwell picked up the forged contract. He tore it in half. "This contract is void," Caldwell stated. "The Reed property remains with the widow and her child. Sheriff Morrison, you will take Mr. Voss into federal custody for fraud, extortion, and forgery, and you will lock the doors of his bank until the federal auditors arrive." The gavel came down. A sharp, loud crack. The courtroom erupted. Men cheered, women cried. 10 years of fear vanished in a single stroke of wood. Elias stood there. He didn't cheer. He felt a hand slip into his. He looked down. Clara was holding his hand. Her fingers were warm. Elias looked at her. He nodded, once. It was over. The storm was gone. February brought a hard freeze, but the sky was clear. The sun shone bright, melting the snow off the high ridges. The Sweetwater Valley was quiet. It was a good, clean quiet. Harlan Voss was in a cell in Cheyenne waiting for a federal trial. The bank was shuttered. The town was breathing again. Elias Cole was breathing too. But the air felt different, lighter. It was mid-morning. Elias stood on the porch of his cabin. He was looking at the jagged peaks to the west. He reached into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed the soft, worn yarn of the unfinished blue baby sock. He had carried it for 5 years. It was heavy, heeler than lead. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was holding James. The baby was 2 months old now. His cheeks were fat. His eyes were wide and taking in the world. She stood next to Elias. She saw his hand in his pocket. She knew what was in it. "It's a beautiful day," Clara said softly. "It is," Elias replied. "You should take a walk," she said, "up to the ridge. I can manage the fire here." Elias looked at her. Her gray eyes were completely open. No fear, no walls, just an understanding that ran deeper than words. She wasn't rushing him. She was giving him permission. "I'll be back," Elias said. "We know," Clara said. Elias stepped off the porch. He walked through the crusty snow, heading toward the high ridge behind the cabin. It took him 20 minutes to climb the slope. His breath plumed white in the cold air. His boots crunched a steady rhythm. He reached the top. The valley stretched out below him, vast, empty, beautiful. He could see his cabin, a tiny square of life in the middle of a massive world. He could see the smoke rising from the chimney. Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out the blue sock. He held it in his calloused palm. He traced the rough stitches with his thumb. For 5 years he had talked to a ghost. He had kept her frozen in that rainy alley in Abilene. He had punished himself every single day. He thought that if he stopped hurting, it meant he stopped loving her. He looked up at the blue sky. "Margaret," Elias whispered. His voice broke, but he cleared his throat and spoke clearly. He wanted her to hear it. "I found someone," Elias said to the wind. "She was freezing in the snow. She had a baby, a boy." He swallowed hard. "I didn't want to stop. You know I didn't. I wanted to just keep riding and let the world end, but I turned around. I turned around, Margaret. And they saved me." A breeze swept over the ridge. It rustled the pine needles. It felt gentle. "I thought loving someone else meant I was leaving you behind," Elias said, tears finally tracing down his weathered cheeks. "But I know better now. You wouldn't want me to be a ghost while I'm still breathing." Elias knelt down. There was a flat slab of granite exposed by the melting snow. He placed the little blue sock gently on the stone. He didn't bury it. He didn't hide it. He just left it there, under the open sky. "Goodbye, Maggie," Elias whispered. The nickname slipped out, and it felt right. He stood up. He took a deep breath. His chest didn't ache. The crushing weight that had sat on his ribs for half a decade was gone. He felt the cold air fill his lungs. He felt alive. Elias turned around. He walked down the mountain. He walked back to the living. When he reached the cabin, Clara was sitting in the rocking chair by the stove. James was in her lap. She looked up as Elias walked in. She saw his face. She saw the change. The deep, tight lines around his eyes had softened. Elias took off his coat. He hung it up. He walked over to her. He knelt down beside the rocking chair. He looked at James. The baby reached out a tiny, uncoordinated hand and grabbed Elias's thumb. Elias smiled. A real, true smile. It changed his entire face. Clara smiled back. Her eyes were shiny. "Can I hold him?" Elias asked. "Of course," Clara said. Elias scooped the baby up. He stood up, cradling James against his chest. He walked over to the window, looking out at the sun reflecting off the snow. He looked down at the tiny boy. James cooed, blowing a small bubble. Elias spoke. He wasn't just talking to the baby. He was talking to Clara. He was talking to himself. He was stating a truth he had earned through blood and ice. "I used to think death was the end of love," Elias said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble in the quiet cabin. "I thought when a heart stopped beating, everything good in the world stopped with it." He gently bounced the baby. James made a happy, gurgling sound. "But you taught me that love is a flowing river," Elias continued, speaking clearly, making sure the words settled into the very timbers of the house. "You can dam it up, you can freeze it over, but it always finds a way to keep moving." Elias turned to look at Clara. She was watching him, completely still, absorbing every word. "I turned my horse around to save you," Elias said to the baby, but keeping his eyes on the mother. "But you were the one who saved me from the winter in my own chest." He stepped back toward the chair. "Healing doesn't mean forgetting," Elias said softly, completing the thought. "It means finding a reason to care again." Clara stood up. She walked over to him. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She simply wrapped her arms around Elias's waist, resting her head against his shoulder while he held the baby. They stood there together, three broken pieces that had found each other in the worst storm of the decade. And together, they were whole. Outside, the snow continued to melt. The earth was softening. The deep freeze of winter was finally breaking, making way for the spring. Summer came to the Sweetwater Valley. It didn't arrive quietly. It came with a rush of green. The winter snow melted hard and fast, filling the dry creeks. The water rushed down from the high ridges, soaking the dead earth. By July of 1879, you couldn't tell a blizzard had ever touched the ground. The grass was thick. It grew tall enough to brush a horse's belly. Wildflowers broke through the soil, painting the hills in sharp yellow and pale blue. The valley was alive. Elias Cole's farm was alive too. He had 60 head of cattle now, a dozen more than he had in the winter. In the barn, a new foal was nursing in the warm shadows. Elias stood on the porch of the cabin. It was 5 in the morning. The sun was just breaking over the eastern peaks, casting long golden shadows across the yard. He held a tin cup of black coffee. The air smelled of wet pine and fresh dirt. He wasn't standing there because he couldn't sleep. He was standing there because he liked the morning. For 5 years he had hated the sunrise. It had just meant another day to survive. Now it meant another day to live. Inside the cabin he heard a sound, a soft, happy babble. Elias turned around. He walked back inside, letting the screen door click shut behind him. James was awake. The baby was 7 months old now. He had outgrown the wooden box by the stove. He slept in a real crib. Nate Birch had built it out of polished oak. It sat in the corner of the room, sturdy and strong. James was standing up, his fat little hands gripping the wooden rails of the crib. He had 2 bottom teeth. When he saw Elias, he grinned, showing them off. "Morning, Jim," Elias said. His voice was a low, quiet rumble. James babbled back, bouncing on his toes. He wanted out. Elias set his coffee down. He reached into the crib and scooped the boy up. James was heavy now, solid. He smelled like milk and clean wool. Elias held him comfortably, resting the boy on his hip. It felt natural, like his arms had finally remembered what they were built for. Clara walked out from behind the canvas curtain that separated the sleeping area. She wore a simple cotton dress. Her hair was down, falling softly over her shoulders. The hollow, haunted look was completely gone from her face. She looked rested. She looked strong. "You're up early," Clara said. "Stock needs feed," Elias said. "And somebody was making a racket." Clara smiled. She walked over and kissed the top of James's head. "He's getting restless. Wants to walk." "He's got time," Elias said. "No rush." They stood there for a moment in the quiet kitchen. The morning light poured through the window, catching the dust motes in the air. It had been 4 months since Judge Caldwell's ruling. The spring had brought the final blow to Harlan Voss. The federal court in Cheyenne didn't care about his money. They cared about the forged deed. Voss was sitting in a federal penitentiary. His bank was under investigation. His land empire was being dismantled piece by piece. Sweetwater was breathing again. The general store reopened. Sheriff Morrison was actually enforcing the law without looking over his shoulder. The fear was gone, and Clara owned her land. The deed was clean. The 400 acres on the west side of the valley belonged to her and James, along with the underground aquifer. That evening, after the day's work was done, Elias and Clara sat on the front porch. The sun was sinking. The sky was burning in shades of orange and bruised purple. The crickets were starting their evening song. James was asleep inside. Elias was whittling a piece of soft pine. Clara was shelling peas into a tin bowl. It was the kind of quiet you earn. "I made a decision today," Clara said. She didn't look up from her work. Her thumbs pressed the green pods open, snapping the peas into the bowl. Elias kept his knife moving. "About the land?" "Yes." Clara paused. "I'm going to keep it. I'm not selling to the Federal Trust. I'm not leasing it out. It belongs to James." Elias nodded slowly. "It's good land. Best water in the valley." Clara looked at him. "But I can't run it alone. And I don't want to live out there. Not in that house. Not where Thomas died." She let the silence sit between them. They both knew what she was asking. Or rather, what she was offering. Elias stopped carving. He closed his pocket knife and slipped it into his jeans. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked out at the darkening fields. "There's something I need to tell you," Elias said. His voice was thick, careful. "About that night, in the snowstorm." Clara put the bowl of peas down on the floorboards. She turned her body toward him. She listened. "I bought this piece of dirt 2 years ago," Elias said, pointing out at his farm. "It was the worst land in Sweetwater. Mostly rock, bad soil. I bought it because I didn't think I'd be alive long enough to need anything better." He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred. "That night on the trail," Elias continued, "when I saw you, I wanted to ride past. Every instinct I had told me to keep my head down and ride away. I wasn't trying to be a hero, Clara." Clara didn't interrupt. She let him find the words. "I turned my horse around," Elias said, looking up to meet her eyes, "because something inside me finally broke. I realized that if I rode past a freezing woman and her baby, I would never stop riding. I would just be a dead man on a horse. I turned around to save you. But the truth is, I did it to save myself." He took a slow, deep breath. "I'm telling you this," Elias said, "because you deserve the truth. I'm a man who spent 5 years running from a ghost. I don't want to run anymore. But I don't want you to think I'm something I'm not." Clara looked at him. She saw the honesty in his face. It was raw and open. "Do you remember the second night I was here?" Clara asked softly. Elias nodded. "You asked me if I had named my baby," Clara said. "And later you asked me about my husband. You asked me his name." "I remember." Clara leaned forward. "Elias, after Thomas died, nobody asked me his name. The bankers, the lawyers, the people in town. They asked me what he owed. They asked me what land he left behind. They treated him like a bad debt. They treated me like a problem to be solved. And they treated my son like collateral." She reached out and placed her hand over his. "You asked for his name," Clara whispered. "You asked it like you wanted to hear it. Like he was a human being. That is the moment I started to trust you. Not because you had a gun. Not because you gave me a warm fire. Because you looked at me, and you saw a person." Elias looked down at her hand covering his. It felt warm. It felt right. "I don't know exactly what we are, Elias," Clara said, "or what we're going to be, but I know I don't want to be anywhere else. We can run the aquifer together. We can run this farm together. We don't dam the water up. We let it flow to the rest of the valley. Fairly." Elias turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "Together," Elias said. It was a simple word, but it held the weight of the whole world. The next afternoon, the sun was hot. Elias was sitting in the thick green grass in the front yard. His hat was pushed back on his head. James was standing in front of him. The baby had a death grip on Elias's thick index fingers. James's little legs were shaking. He was trying to balance. "Take your time, Jim," Elias said gently. James let go of Elias's left finger. He wobbled. He threw his arms out wide to catch himself. He stood there, entirely on his own, for 3 long seconds. Then, gravity won. He plopped down hard on his diapered bottom in the soft grass. He didn't cry. He looked at Elias, and he laughed. A bright bell-like sound. He liked the game. He liked trying and falling and trying again. Elias smiled. He held his fingers out again. "One more time," Elias said. James grabbed his fingers and pulled himself back up. Clara stood on the porch holding a pitcher of lemonade. She watched the massive, hardened man sitting in the dirt, patiently letting a baby fall and stand. She walked down the steps. She set the pitcher and 2 tin cups on a wooden stump. She sat down in the grass next to Elias. The fabric of her dress settled around her. James let go of Elias's fingers again. This time he took one tiny, uncoordinated step forward. He reached for Clara. She caught him before he fell, pulling him into her lap and kissing his cheek. James giggled, grabbing a handful of her hair. Elias leaned back on his hands, looking at the two of them. "He's getting brave," Elias said. "He is," Clara agreed. She gently untangled her hair from James's fist. She looked up at Elias. Her face turned serious. The light, happy moment settled into something deeper, something profound. "We have a massive job ahead of us, Elias," Clara said. Her voice was firm, steady. "The water?" Elias asked. "We'll manage it. Nate will help dig the new irrigation lines." "No," Clara said. "Not the water. Him." She looked down at James. Elias sat up a little straighter. He listened. Clara looked out over the vast, open valley. She thought about Harlan Voss. She thought about the lawyers. She thought about the cold, terrifying nights when she had been reduced to nothing but a piece of property. She turned back to Elias. She needed to say it out loud. She needed it to be spoken into the open air. "We have to teach this boy how to live in this world," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and absolute. "And we have to teach him right." "I'll teach him to ride," Elias said softly. "I'll teach him to track. He'll know how to survive." "That's not enough," Clara stated. She looked Elias directly in the eye. "We will teach this boy that a Western man's true strength isn't in the gun on his hip. It is in the hands willing to build. It is in the courage to stop and listen when the rest of the world keeps riding." Elias held her gaze. He didn't blink. He absorbed every word. "We have to tell him, Elias. We have to speak it," Clara continued, her tone filled with a fierce educational fire. "A society cannot survive. It cannot call itself civilized if it treats women like property and children like debts. We have to teach him that the law is not justice if it strips away fundamental human rights." She placed her hand on James's small back. "We have to teach him that equality isn't just a word written in a judge's book," Clara said, her voice full of passion and clarity. "Equality is the action you take. It is how you treat the person freezing in the snow. It is looking at every man and every woman as a free and equal human being. Compassion is the only true measure of a man." Elias sat there in the warm summer grass. He heard the pain of her past, and he heard the fierce hope for the future. He reached out and placed his large hand over hers. "I hear you, Clara," Elias said. His voice was a solemn vow. "I will teach him. We will teach him. I promise you that." Clara looked at his hand. She looked at his face. The face of a man who had walked through hell and had finally found his way out. She smiled, a deep, peaceful smile. "I know you will," she said. They sat together in the grass as the afternoon stretched into evening. The crickets began to chirp. The wind blew gently through the high plains, carrying the scent of pine and sweet grass. Elias Cole had once bought the worst piece of land in the valley, because he didn't plan on staying in this world much longer. He had been wrong. Bad land, if you water it, can bloom. Broken people, if you give them time and truth, can heal. Sometimes on a dark night in a blinding snowstorm, on a trail you were supposed to just keep riding down, you make a choice. Not because you know what is waiting for you, but because a tiny piece of your soul reminds you that stopping is an option. He saw a mother. He saw a child. He turned his horse around. And that was enough. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
As the wind finally quiets over Sweetwater and the long shadow of winter begins to loosen its grip, what remains is not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of something far more enduring. Elias Cole stands no longer as a man hiding from his past, but as someone who has chosen to face it, reshape it, and ultimately rise above it. Clara, once hunted and cornered by a world that saw her as powerless, now stands rooted in dignity, no longer defined by loss, but by her courage to protect what matters most. And the child, small, fragile, yet fiercely alive, becomes more than just a life saved. He becomes a symbol, a quiet promise that even in the harshest lands, something good can still take root. What this story leaves us with is not just the image of justice served or evil brought to account. It leaves us with a deeper truth about what it means to be human. Because in the end, the greatest conflict was never between Elias and Voss, nor between law and corruption. It was within Elias himself, the choice between turning away or stopping, between protecting his own wounds or opening his heart again. And that is a choice every one of us faces, in ways big or small. The meaning of this story lies in the idea that compassion is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. Elias had every reason to keep riding that day, to ignore the cry in the snow, to protect himself from pain. But had he done so, he would have lost something far greater than safety. He would have lost his humanity. And that is the quiet warning this story gives us. When we become too afraid to care, too tired to help, too broken to feel, we risk becoming as cold as the world around us. It also reminds us that justice is not always found in systems, titles, or laws written on paper. Sometimes those very systems fail. Sometimes they are twisted by those in power. But true justice, real justice, lives in the courage of ordinary people who choose to stand up when it matters. In Clara, who refused to surrender her child. In Ruth, who spoke truth without hesitation. In the sheriff and the townspeople, who finally found the strength to break their silence. Change did not come from power, it came from people who refused to accept what was wrong. And perhaps most importantly, this story speaks to the idea that our past does not have the final say. Elias carried guilt like a shadow for years, believing that his life had ended the moment he lost everything. But healing did not come from forgetting. It came from choosing to act differently when given another chance. Redemption is not something we find. It is something we build, one decision at a time. So when you walk away from this story, maybe the question to carry with you is this. When your moment comes, when the world gives you a chance to stop, to help, to stand for something, what will you choose? Because in the end, it is not the storms we face that define us, but whether we decide to turn back into them for someone else.